Hi there, and welcome to a special edition of SitRep, the podcast powered by Samdesk. I'm Tristan Field-Jones, joined along with MJ Banias. And recently we've seen Russia hold some sham referendums in regions of Ukraine, and they have claimed to have annexed several regions which that country does not fully control. The rhetoric surrounding nuclear weapons, especially coming from Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin, has really increased over the last little while, and there's been a lot of concern surrounding the possibility of nuclear weapons. Now, of course, our job here is to kind of cut through that and figure out what is the actual risk. You know, we deal with risk and threats and concerns and those sorts of things. It may sound scary, but I know from a lot of folks that are out there, and especially our next guest, it probably isn't nearly as bad as you may think. So we're going to drill down on that today. MJ, please introduce who you've brought along for us to chat with regarding this topic that I'm sure is on top of mind for everybody right now.
Thanks, Tristan. So today we have joining us Tim McMillan. He is a defense reporter for the news site The Debrief. So to start off, Tim, there's been a lot of news chatter, headlines, TV, whatever, lots of discussion in the media about sort of Vladimir Putin's rhetoric concerning nuclear armament. There's been a lot of reports of a nuclear train, quote unquote, leaving its sort of standard position and moving closer to the front line with Ukraine. There's been talk of a large submarine that carries a weapon known as Poseidon, allegedly missing from the port that it was stationed at and is now cruising around somewhere mysteriously. There's been discussion of 1,600-foot tsunamis irradiated with nuclear waste slamming into New York City. So we've had a lot of media reports about the nuclear Armageddon that is going to befall all of us. Tim, you have been covering Russia now since the beginning of the war, and even longer, but really since the beginning of the war, you've been diving deep into this topic. Can you let us know kind of the situation on the ground right now concerning the nuclear threat Russia poses sort of at this moment?
Sure. I think first of all, I think we can sum up everything that you just mentioned, including like the nuclear train and the submarine, all of the stuff, and really that all the oxygen in kind of the information sphere has been sucked up with all this talk and hand-wringing a lot in the West about nuclear weapons, can be summed up as a great example of something that honestly, giving the devil his due, that Vladimir Putin and Russia do very, very well, which is control the information space. And in particular, that they engage in a type of information warfare called reflexive control. And so with reflexive control, what it is they kind of seed these little things, and then they just let people run with it. And the object is to influence this decision making. And so it's been kind of fascinating for me to watch, because that the psyops and kind of information warfare angle from Russia has really been the primary focus of my interest for years, even before the war. But to see it kind of operating in real time is fascinating. And it is something that they're really good at, because once you stop and sit down for a minute, and you realize that, let's say, 3 weeks ago, all the conversation was on the counteroffensives going on in the Kharkiv region. All the, Russia was backpedaling, still backpedaling, losses of ground, Vladimir Putin enacted mobilization. That's going terribly. Really, all the conversation is on how bad things are going. And then suddenly, it flips with this announced sham annexation. And now all of a sudden, he's talking about nuclear war. Now everybody's talking about nuclear war. It's kind of amazing. If you really fundamentally look at it, nothing changed. And in fact, more has gone wrong for Russia since that's gone on. They just lost Lyman, which is a very important strategic point in the East. And they're losing ground in Kherson. But to get down to the brass tacks here, okay? The first thing, probably to peer through and dispel some of the concern, I guess. We'll start with, you want to start with the nuclear train? That sounds so Nazi Germany-esque, a rail weapon, type thing. So it makes for great headlines. but let's when you narrow down where that came from, it's fascinating because our original source for this information of this nuclear train, coming to us, actually comes from a fairly well-known Russian military blogger, Rybar, who actually is known for being pretty objective in his analysis of how the war's going. He reports on a lot of the military losses, but the initial reports that we get that this nuclear division is on the move comes from him. So our first source comes out of Russia. It's kind of one of the first clues that you got to look at and wonder how valid something is. And most importantly, I think it's been interesting to watch this because we've heard it reported as a nuclear train. As recently as today, there's still headlines going on about this nuclear train. There's absolutely zero evidence and this pertains to a video that Rybar shared of a video moving down the tracks with some equipment on it that they claim was part of the 12th Chief Directorate, which is the unit in Russia tasked with guarding their nuclear weapons, not deploying them, just guarding them. But again, that claim comes just from him, and people ran with it. This was the nuclear train is on the move, but the only equipment we see are just BMPs, just normal Russian armored personnel carriers is what we're seeing there. The ones that we're showing are a little bit more, they're a little bit more advanced than you see on typically spread out through there. They've got the big BM-30D turrets on it. Okay, the big rocket turrets. But these went into mass production in May. And so that's what we see. We don't see any nuclear equipment whatsoever. There's nothing on those trains that indicate nuclear equipment. We just see these BMP-30s with the turrets on them. And then this claim from a Russian mill blogger that these are part of the 12th Military Directorate out of Russia. That's it. There's no nuclear missiles on it. There's nothing like that.
Well, and MJ referenced this massive submarine that has supposedly gone missing or might be lurking in the waters or who knows what. And to be fair, when you look at the submarine and you look at its potential capabilities that we know of, it is impressive and it does have the potential to be a threat. But I did, because I heard about that story too. I did a little digging around, and it turns out that the submarine was originally commissioned in the early 90s, and it took them this long to actually get it built. And it sounds like it's a really recent launch. So what would you normally do with a ship, with any ship that you've launched recently? You send it out to sea. Now, of course, there's a little bit more involved in this because of the war, because it's, again, it is a pretty impressive piece of equipment. But, at the end of the day, Tim, a submarine leaving port does not mean that we're going to expect a nuclear strike anytime soon.
In particular, this sub specifically, and I truly believe, I think some of the kind of Chicken Little running around the sky is falling, nukes are going to be raining down, came from the initial report of the Belgorod, which this is the sub that's on the move here. It is indeed the largest known submarine in the world, and it was just commissioned. It just went underway at the 1st of July. So, I mean, it's only a couple months old. And as you mentioned, it's Russia has been working on it for 30 years. So they just now put it in the water. But the initial claims about the Belgrade quote going missing or being on the move, were reported in Italian media, supposedly from NATO warnings given. So the United States intelligence provided to NATO allies warning that the Belgrade had left port. Now, I think that was just the initial claims, and when it was presented, the media outlet itself, or even has subsequently through social media and everything else, it's kind of like the telephone game, really expanded on it when people started associating the Belgorod with the Poseidon nuclear missile, or nuclear torpedo, because that's the Belgorod was designed to potentially carry the Poseidon at some point. And so I think people, oh my gosh, if the United States is warning NATO, it's on the loose, it's missing, this must mean there's nuclear potential. I think there's a huge misinterpretation of that NATO warning or in that U.S. warning to begin with, for very good reason. I'll describe in a minute. But that sub itself, it belongs to a very special unit within the Russian Navy called the GUGI. And in fact, it's often referred to as Putin's or Russia's secret navy. This is their deep sea research unit. And what it actually is a deep sea espionage unit. They operate about a half a dozen special subs that can release different kind of both manned and uncrewed submersibles. Really, their main task is tapping into underwater cables, surveillance, espionage. It's an espionage unit. It is a Spetsnaz, a special forces unit, but it's all espionage centered. And so when it left port, it also left port just around the same time that actually, having not read the NATO intelligence myself, I don't know when it was supposedly left port, but at least we found out about it all around the same time as the Nord Stream 2 pipeline explosion. So I genuinely believe that the initial warnings related to the fact that you had a deep sea espionage submersible that had left port, was on the loose, and it related to espionage activities, related to different spy activities, possibly some testing with that sub because it's brand new in the Arctic. But in terms of the Poseidon nuclear torpedo, first of all, what the Poseidon is supposed to be is this nuclear powered super torpedo that essentially, no nation would have a counter for. It could slam nuclear torpedoes into the coastlines of areas and would essentially cause giant nuclear tsunamis. I mean, it could cause devastation theoretically. However, the Poseidon doesn't exist. This is another project that Russia is working on, claims to be working on, but just like the Belgrade, as you mentioned, great example. They've been working on that for 30 years before they put it into the water, and frankly, earlier than when they, even as they put it in, it was earlier than what their expectation was, because their expectation was they would be able to have the Poseidon torpedoes with it. They could arm it, have this big, scary, giant sub out there. But the threat of the Belgrade delivering nuclear weapons is virtually nil because it's not outfitted to deliver nuclear weapons. Certainly not the Poseidon, because the Poseidon doesn't exist yet.
So I think we've done a good job kind of outlining that there's been a lot of overexcitement, let's say, concerning these recent kind of events concerning the Belgrade and this nuclear train. But let's kind of pivot to maybe the general anxiety that exists concerning this war. You have a sort of a megalomaniac leader who was convinced he was going to take Ukraine in 3 days. It's dragged on for months, and now he's actively losing territory that he once possessed prior to the invasion. The Ukrainians are pushing hard as winter gets closer to take as much territory as they can. It's now becoming, for Putin, a bit of a personal and maybe glory-based issue, in the sense that his legacy will suffer potentially because he somehow mucked up what should have been one of the easiest invasions in the 20th century and 21st century, and it's become the hardest invasion that Russia has probably ever had to fight, next to something in the Second World War. But at what point do we have concern that Mr. Putin himself will decide that I'm going to use a small nuclear weapon and do a tactical strike on a Ukrainian target in order to attempt to force the Ukrainians to capitulate?
Sure. I think that the concern over the use of nuclear weapons in this conflict, and just to clarify, Ukraine has not taken back any territory yet that Russia didn't have prior to the invasion. So everything that they've recovered thus far has actually occurred since the invasion, and frankly, Russia still controls large portions of Ukrainian land, both after the February 24th invasion, and then also what they have already been holding de facto, both with Crimea and in the Donbass region. And so, though there's been some really successful counteroffensives, Russia still has a lot of territory to maintain. And I think that obviously the chances of Vladimir Putin and Russia using nuclear weapons in this war are not zero. However, I do believe that those chances are exceptionally low, particularly now. I would consider them as close as you could get to zero where the war sits right now. And I know we've heard a lot, and a lot of people have talked about, well, what if they just use a tactical nuclear weapon, which is a low yield nuclear weapon to be deployed in the battlefield, so just on Ukrainian troops and potentially there, if it's just something like that. We're not talking about delivering a strategic nuclear weapon to Kiev, that would somehow be acceptable to the international community, and Putin could get away with that. But one real big problem with that is I am really confident, based on what we've seen and just in people I've spoken with in the intelligence community, in the military intelligence community, that Russia doesn't possess the capability to operate on a nuclear battlefield. That's very important. So if you're going to deliver a tactical nuclear weapon, we tend to think of it in terms of like we think in the movies. You drop a nuke and you just obliterate this giant swath of land, and now it's no man's land forever. Well, that doesn't really do you a whole lot of good. Especially if you're trying to annex new territory. What is the point of spreading out this wasteland? And more importantly, when you're using the tactical nuclear weapon, it doesn't create that wasteland per se. It just creates massive devastation, while still you have the radioactive effects that you would with a nuclear weapon. You have to be able to operate in that domain then. So your troops are going to have to go into those areas. If Putin was to deploy a tactical nuclear weapon, let's say on the eastern Donbass front, somewhere near Lyman, to save face, he didn't deploy it directly on a city, but maybe a major hub where you had Ukrainian forces. One problem there is that Ukraine has done a very good job of how they've done their operational deployment and maintained interior lines. So you're not going to get 100,000 Ukrainian troops in one little tract of land that you could drop a tactical nuclear weapon on and have this decisive effect that you're looking for. You could potentially drop one and take out a portion of troops, but it would still leave a number of remaining troops on the battlefield, which I don't think Ukraine would capitulate at that point. They have kind of put it that they're willing to fight. But then in that same area, you're going to have to operate now. Your troops are going to have to operate in that area. And I really am pretty confident that Russia doesn't have the equipment. They don't, the Soviet Union did. The modern Russian army, I do not believe, is equipped to operate on a nuclear battlefield. So yeah, the idea of using tactical nuclear weapons to try to turn the tide of war, I think those chances are pretty low because they wouldn't necessarily turn the tide of war to Putin's favor. So you look at, well, at what point does it become a consideration? I don't know. I mean, I've not wavered from this kind of gut feeling that the political and just general geopolitical consequences of using nuclear weapons could be so significant that I find it hard to believe that even Putin, who really does a good job portraying himself as a reckless nuclear power and as a madman, but that he would be willing to do that in order to achieve a victory for territories that he did not possess prior to February 24th. It's not that significant, I don't think, based on the consequences and outcomes. And so I don't see that we're close to a point whatsoever there. But I do think that is not something that would sneak up on us type deal. And there would be a lot better intelligence than what this nuclear train or a sub leading. This is not something that is going to get past Western intelligence agencies. And, NATO and the U.S. have kind of firmly said that using nuclear weapons would be a red line. And I think that's also factors in to Putin's decision making, because you don't want to be the leader who lost the big war here for the Russian Federation, but do you also want to be the leader that initiated the total destruction of the Russian Federation?
We have security professionals that we interview on this podcast all the time, and that's a lot of our audience. And the fact of the matter is, it may be saber rattling, it may be, fueling the information stream, it may just be a matter of getting people scared, but at the end of the day, even if that is a remote possibility, you still have to prepare for it. And I think for a lot of people, that's the concerning part, because again, these weapons are just we talk about a small nuke. There really is no such thing as a small nuke, because let's face it, by today's standards, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were small nukes, and we know what the devastation of those caused.
No, you're absolutely right. I think, the fact that there is a non-zero chance of it using, you have to weigh those factors in every decision making. And I think for a large part, that's what we've seen out of NATO in the West. They've tried to tightrope this line of saying, we're willing to provide X amount of aid, but not this, because maybe that crosses the line too much. And I agree wholeheartedly. I think that if anything else, when it comes to the general global national security space, what we're seeing in this conflict has kind of reinforced this idea. I think after the end of the Cold War, the idea of anyone using nukes, aside from maybe North Korea, who's constantly threatening it, people didn't think that was even a possibility. I think that this war has changed a lot in the defense security space and where people need to be thinking, because I think for a lot of people kind of assume that wars of conquest, that just invading a country and wanting to take it over was of the past. Like that's, since World War II, we're not going to see that. You might see regional conflicts that flare up here and there, but at the scale that we're seeing here, that's unthinkable. But it clearly can happen. And so that's something I think people need to factor in. It's important to understand that how Russia views losing, and where we in the West right now would definitely, especially when you're talking about tens of thousands of Russian soldiers believed to be killed, we're getting 60, 70,000 by some estimate. The West would never have the stomach for that. That's just, we would never have the stomach for that. Whereas Russia views it much differently. And in fact, their idea that they're losing, I'm not sure that Vladimir Putin really believes he's losing this war, because he can contrast that against, Russian history. You look at Napoleon invaded. You look at World War II is a great example. Russia has always been this country that has gone to the verge of collapse and then has reignited itself to score these great victories. So the fact that everything appears to be so detrimental right now for Russia, I don't think that I could be wrong, but I don't think that Putin and his inner circle view that as meaning that the Russian military in Russia is on the edge of defeat. This is just kind of par for the course. This is how they've won every major war, really, that they've been in for the last 200 years. And so for me, I think that when it comes to using nuclear weapons and everything, I think that Putin and his inner circles there believe they've got lots of time before that even comes into frame. That they're willing to, one thing I will say is that Russia has always demonstrated a remarkable ability to kind of outsuffer their adversary. Like they're willing to really just take on enormous suffering when it comes to conflict, but then somehow just bend but not break and then come back. And I think that they're going to view that the same. Whether that is going to be the case in this conflict or not, I don't know.
So we've covered a lot of ground throughout the podcast. We've discussed many angles in terms of where this war may be headed and some of the biggest risks. Now, as we've mentioned several times, the actual risk of a nuclear weapon being used is quite low. But the fact is, a lot of security professionals who listen to this podcast hope for the best, plan for the worst. And the fact is, you still, even if it's a 0.1% chance, you still need to plan for the marginal possibility that a nuke may be used and there may be consequences to that. So if you're a security professional, you're listening to this, and you're trying to plan out what you can do, what would be some advice in terms of that? What are some ways that these folks can plan appropriately and adequately for this circumstance while being, I guess, again, as realistic as possible without keeping your head in the sand?
Sure. No, I think that that's a great question. I think it's important to say up front that, the nuclear threat can be low, but the general threat, not, I mean, outside of what's going on in Ukraine, but when you talk about to commercial interests, commercial industry, that can be significant. You don't need a nuke to cause a potential problem and a security risk. You know, anything if we had this in 2014, if you have the inadvertent downing of a commercial aircraft, suddenly you're talking about great risk to the commercial airline industry. There's obviously huge risk when it comes to maritime shipping in this region. If somebody was to down a merchant vessel, so there's a lot of risk here. I don't, and I think that's one of to answer your question, that's one of the key points that I would say is not get too sucked into the sexy fear stuff, like the nuclear weapon stuff. That's very attractive. That generates headlines because it is, these are the most destructive weapons that man has ever known. But there's a lot of things that are going on here in this conflict that are equally concerning and frankly pose a more significant risk because they're more likely and they're more, they're going on continuously. And so I think that would be one of my best points of advice would be not to get sucked into those really headline grabbing hyperbolic risks, nuclear threat, but stay informed. That's the most important thing, is to stay informed, make sure that you're informed about what is actually going on in the ground and how that affects outside of just Ukraine, depending whatever sector, because it does. I mean, it definitely does. I'm here in Germany, and I can tell you we're dealing with instances of Russian espionage right now related to the conflict, related to the military bases. I'm right here by NATO Air Command at Ramstein, which is, kind of the focal point. So there's instances of espionage going on, this type of stuff. So, when it comes to all of the risks that are posed there, I think being informed, and then it's hard to broadly say how anyone can protect themselves, but know your sector and knowing what risks are specific to your sector. If you're in a technology sector, know that you could be on a high risk for espionage, or better yet, theft of technology, embargo, circumventing embargoes and sanctions. I think that's a huge potential in the technology sector that hopefully security professionals there are looking into, because the fact of Russia needs a lot of technologies that are currently under sanction, and their ability to obtain those, that equipment's being used for the manufacture of weapons. And so that risk tier is multi-tier. It can be a lot of different things, but I think the most important thing would be knowing what risk your specific area is vulnerable to, and then really getting as much information in that domain as you possibly can.
Can we dive into what security experts should do to stay aware of the surrounding issues? Like, how do they stay on top of this, as well as diving potentially into a bit more of this technology? And I know cybersecurity is always a key factor. So can we jump into that sort of briefly? Because I think it's important.
Sure. No, I think you bring up an excellent point here, in that I think it's important for people in industry, no matter how far removed from the war you may think you are, to realize that there's potential for this war to impact you, your industry, your different companies. It doesn't matter whether you're implicitly even involved in some type of military program or anything like that. You can be involved in any commercial endeavor. And the fact of the matter is that because of sanctions, because of Russia's economy right now, one thing, aside from weapons and bodies to go fight a war, they're also in bad need of currency. And so we know very well that Russia, Russia's abilities to engage in cyber warfare are really sophisticated. I think that's an area that we've kind of underappreciated since this war started, because we have seen their land forces perform so poorly. From what we're seeing here, we've forgotten about all of the espionage and all the cyber warfare that Russia was able to do, that they were able to really steal the keys of the kingdom from U.S. intelligence agencies, infiltrate, the federal government. And this is, they were able to navigate through, some of the best cybersecurity layers that are out there. And, their they're kind of holding ransom, the ransomware that they'll do, where they'll hold things. We've seen that with Colonial Oil, where they hold these companies ransom for millions of dollars. We've seen, the Washington, D.C. Metro Police Department was held ransom. So I think that that's an important one, that even if you are in an industry that feels very far removed from it, is to recognize what are your vulnerabilities.
Can we talk about the physical security as well? Because I know, Tim, that you've been, I know currently you're looking into a story about drone activity over Germany. Can we talk about how, from a physical security perspective, what security professionals can do, not just with drones, but just in general, about monitoring the situation sort of around them? Are they a potential target? And will this war somehow affect them, even though they feel far removed?
Sure. It's going to depend on what sector that you're working in, but understand that when it comes to Russia and how they engage in gray zone warfare, so asymmetrical attacks, and this is something that they consistently do, but it is somewhat of a necessity now with the Ukrainian war, because they need financial resources, and suddenly the ability to gain both commercial espionage and military espionage becomes huge. Anything that they can do to give their industry an advantage or their military an advantage becomes huge. But what goes hand in hand, and oftentimes in their cyber attacks or their social engineering attacks, their penetration attacks, whether it's physical penetration, gaining access to facilities and everything, involves really this human element where they monitor their targets. They get to know their targets well. They know their likes. They know what potentially would be good avenues that they can get into. And that's, this is another area where Russia has demonstrated the capacity to be very good at. In fact, I just did, it was actually Bellingcat who uncovered it, but I just followed up on a good article that they did where right here, not far from me, in Naples Naval Base, a NATO base here, a Russian agent was able to infiltrate the inner circles there, portraying herself as a jewelry salesman and kind of a socialite. This is like the TV show The Americans and everything. This actually goes on. This goes on far more than people realize, and Russia's really good at it. They have this human intelligence element here, where they're able to integrate these agents for years, decades at a time, where they go there and you may not even know that they're Russian at all. They may not speak Russian. They may not have any accent. In fact, they won't. I mean, that's part of kind of this idea, what they call the illegals program that FSB runs. And so you really need to know, are you working in a sector that could provide information that Russia would be interested in, or do you have access to it? Are you working in for a company that does government contracts? Are you good friends with somebody who does government contracts? Is your spouse or somebody do they have a top secret clearance, and do they have information? You might not, but it's all about getting close to them. So I think this idea, again, it's something that we kind of, after the Cold War ended and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we kind of put all that aside. I certainly don't think we need to start the McCarthy era here, where we're going on witch hunts for communists. But I think it's being aware of the fact that whether or not you're vulnerable to certain things, and just be conscientious of what's your environment, what's going on, who is the person that's trying to gain access to a business, trying to gain access to your home, and why, and what are they looking at?
Tim, thanks very much for coming on the SITREP to talk about this and really dispel some of the myths and the fears, but also, update us on what's going on and provide some context for people within the security world. Where can people find your work if they're interested in following you and your writing?
Sure. You can find me and my work on thedebrief.org. So we cover science and technology, but also I cover the defense beat there. My email and Twitter handle is all there. You can feel free to contact me and call me names if you want to, or share any good information. I'm always up for that.
Thanks very much, Tim. This was great. I appreciate it.
Sure. No, it's fun. A pleasure anytime.
I'm Tristan Field-Jones along with MJ Banias. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email sitrep@samdesk.io or follow us on Twitter, Find us on LinkedIn. Just look up SamDesk, all one word. Until next time, stay safe out there.